Hello, movie fans. We are the Cinema Joes back again, and this time we have a special treat for you. We're going all the way back, looking back at the Star Wars original trilogy, one of some of my favorite movies. We were just talking earlier about comparing our Star Wars books to one another. Oh my lord, do I am I the king of Star Wars among these people, among these plebeians? So let me pass it off to Justin. He's got some thought-provoking questions for us.
Well, guys, having revisited this, honestly, I don't know about you guys, but it had been a long time for me since I had seen any of the original trilogy. I'm talking at least a decade, and since then, I've sort of seen Star Wars defined not just by the movie itself, but by everything, the memories attached to it, the world. Because of those movies, there was an expanded universe that sprung up and dared to tell stories that maybe they couldn't do in the movies because there's just so much there. So I guess my question for you is, what did you think in terms of your memories of the movie versus your viewing experience now? Did anything change for you? Did it reinforce your memories, or was it a mixture of the two?
It's a big question. I think the best part about the first Star Wars movie, and perhaps all of them, is that it's the first step into this, like you were saying, this huge universe. And when it came out, it was the only thing, but it suggested so much more. Like, what is the Force? What were the Jedi? And these questions inspired imagination. And it's hard going back and trying to separate this movie from all the other lore that we know and all the memories and fondnesses that we've grown up with over the years. And if I had to try to watch the movie objectively as I did last week, I don't know how well it aged by itself. There, especially one of the things that stood out to me was some of the weird physicality, especially and line deliverances and even lines themselves.
Well, I was going to ask you, are you specifically talking about the actors?
Well, physically, I was talking about Darth Vader, and I do know that why they that's true. But there's just one scene where he's like, "There's a presence I haven't felt in," and he just like turns away awkwardly. And it's small moments like that riddled throughout the movie that kind of, when you try to watch the movie objectively, it's like it almost takes you out of it.
Well, you have to. I think you have to remember that when this came out, this was because here's the thing: Lucas has always gone for the most groundbreaking graphics that he could achieve at the time, and given his resources. Like he's always gone. He's always gone big. I think
Yeah.
people forget that. Like we were talking earlier about how people hate on the prequels because they went for much more flash and much more show. Lucas would have used the same technology in the 1970s if he'd had access to it. So I think you have to kind of remember that when this came out, no one had ever seen a movie try to tell a story like this.
Right.
I mean, there had been Star Trek and Doctor Who prior to that in the sci-fi world, but those were so low budget that they couldn't go for spectacle. They had to have interesting ideas, and they had to focus on dialogue and delivery and acting in order to sell themselves. I think Lucas was kind of fortunate in that because there is a lot of awkward acting in the movie. It's like there are tales about how much Alec Guinness despised being in the movie. Harrison Ford doesn't look like he wants to be there at all. That was like, even as a kid when I first saw this movie, I was like, that man is a funny delivery of his lines.
I think even James Earl Jones wouldn't let his name be on the credits for the first movie.
Wait, seriously?
I think I have to find a source. I don't know if this is true, but he was just coming out of like school and he didn't want to be known as this fantasy kind of guy.
I think I remember reading that on like IMDb or something. It's funny, like I found watching it this time, I was half expecting it in some ways, so I feel like I was able to forgive a lot of it. That said, I don't know if I necessarily agree with what you said, Noah, about Harrison Ford, because I'll just always love him in these movies. It might sound a little weird, but I feel like that distinguishes that character. And it's funny, like, say, like, you think he doesn't want to be there, but I get the sense he's having the time of his life. I mean, he really stands out from every other character because there was apparently a lot of improvisation that he did. The whole scene where he's trying to communicate with the other stormtroopers when they're at the cell block about how they don't need to come up there. That's just one of the funniest scenes in the trilogy that I can think of.
We're all fine. We're all good. How are you?
sounds like he's making it up on the fly, which he was. Harrison Ford was making it up on the fly, and he was actually encouraged by Lucas to do that. I feel like there are things that he added that might not have been there otherwise. So
I'm not disagreeing. It's just I don't know. I couldn't tell why it is, but it always struck me that there were. It's let me put it this way. I've never seen quite another performance like it. You could put it that way, but I feel that what I'm saying is I don't disagree with Casey that there is a certain aspect to the acting where again, you could tell, okay, this was lower budget. They might not have, completely known what they were going to try to do with this. They were just sort of, they were kind of working in this as it went along, and then of course it ended up becoming really big, and they were able to go further with it.
I also will excuse Darth Vader's awkwardness because the man who voiced him and the man who actually bodied him were completely two different people. They didn't even the guy who bodied Darth Vader, David Prowse, I think his name is, didn't even know they were. He thought he would be the voice of Darth Vader, and only at the very end in post production did Lucas or whomever bring in James Earl Jones to deliver that classic voice. So there's that kind of overlay as well to make his character worse.
I have to say, one aspect of the movie that I think where you do notice the age. I think for me, A New Hope is torn between stuff that has aged very well and stuff that has not aged as well. It is much slower moving than you might expect. I think it's certainly the slowest moving and the quietest of all six movies. I mean, especially in the first two thirds when they first meet Obi Wan, going to Mos Eisley, getting the ship, going to Alderaan, getting captured. There are a lot of scenes without dialogue, without big music, without big action, which is I think is neither good nor bad, but it's something where you kind of notice that the movie couldn't necessarily be as big as it wanted to be. And it is something that, for me, does take the movie down a peg when you're watching it years later, after the first time you see it. And then you're like, there's a lot of stuff here they could have shortened or maybe cut out. But on the other hand, of course, someone could see stuff like that as atmospheric. So I think that depends on the person.
You have to think about the first time we watched it too. The first time you watch those long scenes where, like, for example, when Luke is standing on the edge of his farm and he sees that the double sunrise, that's a long scene.
I'm not thinking of that scene. I'm not thinking of that scene. I'm thinking of like a lot of scenes in ships where they're going from one place to another and they're just sort of sitting there.
When they're going to Alderaan and they're talking about the Force. That's to me that's world building. But you're right, it is slow because it is trying to build up this greater world.
But I mean, even the dialogue, the delivery is a bit slower than you might normally expect. I mean, Luke's delivery on a lot of lines is also very like he goes slower, he enunciates more, he says things more clearly. I would say I don't think it's a very naturalistic acting style. I would say how there are some types of acting where you're trying to sound like a normal person, like just going into Starbucks in the morning, getting their coffee, and going to work. And then there's types of acting that are deliberately more stylized, where you emphasize what you're saying a lot more. And I think there's a lot of that type of acting in this movie, or at least that struck me watching it again.
part of that may be there's a lot of British actors in this movie. Alec Guinness, of course, is the most obvious one, who, of course, infamously so, has said that he did not like working on this movie. He hated doing publicity for it, all these other things. Funnily enough, the reason why he got involved, I think, was because he was a fan of George Lucas's film before this one, American Graffiti, which is very different, at least in terms of the world that it's creating, because I believe it takes place in the 50s and in this small town.
As far as we know, there's no American Graffiti extended universe.
I mean, yeah. But it's funny, I know that, he didn't like working on this movie, but at the same time, just seeing his performance in this movie, there is a sophistication to his performance, and there's also that he brings, a sly humor to it. He very much seems to know what's going to happen next. He seems hopeful and optimistic in certain scenes. Certainly his death scene is not, it's not him, losing as much as realizing that he can serve a greater purpose. And it's very much a tranquil kind of acquiescence of his situation.
Well, of course, later on we learn that it wasn't actual death. He actually had, developed a technique of melding with the Force that even the Emperor and Vader didn't know about.
Or you could choose to read it metaphorically as him dying and becoming something larger and greater than what he was as a physical person.
Well, I think, in the case of Luke, what I think really, really makes his performance work And really, what makes all of them work is there is a really great sense of camaraderie and chemistry between Luke, Leia, and Han. And ultimately, I think that that's the one thing more than anything else that raises the originals above the prequels and makes them legitimately great movies. I mean, a lot of people talk about there was too much CGI in the new ones, and the practical effects had more effort and were more interesting, and had more passion. And that's all true, but that's still just external show. That's not enough to make a movie great. The originals, yeah, there was the extra effort that had to go into making all the models they used, and that's true. But what really took it to the next level was having those three as the consistent core.
It was the characters that what makes Star Wars great.
And
I'm
that's
convinced
what the
is
prequels lacked in the end.
really interesting, in-depth characters and
And we,
relationships.
we see a lot of that in A New Hope. I mean, Luke's performance, I think he has the right level of sort of self-awareness, but also able to bring across like the innocence and naivete that Luke has at that point. And it's like it's just the right mix. It's not too much of one thing or too much of another thing. It's right on balance. And as a lot of people pointed out, you have a really good actor doing a great job at this, and he's being put on the very classic hero's journey, which is one of the, I don't know, arguably the most popular, or at least the most relatable type of story you can tell. Imagining someone like yourself going on this grand adventure.
I mean, certainly the one feeling that I got from his time on Tatooine with his aunt and uncle is just restlessness. I mean, just like waiting for something bigger. I mean, he wants the chance to go to the academy, he says. Maybe that was somewhat similar to American Graffiti, where you had these people who were trying to get out of their small town and, move out and find something bigger to do with their lives. That's what I love about that scene that we mentioned about the twin sons. It's almost mournful, but it's also hopeful. It's like he's standing on the cusp of something and doesn't quite know what it is yet. But yeah, you're right, Noah. He does have that innocence, naivete, and I don't know if it's like an amazing performance from Mark Hamill, but it does invest you. Like you said, you're able to see yourself in him and see that he's a genuinely good person, even as we
Yeah.
learn later on that he has some darker traits as well.
He never gets too whiny. You see the restlessness, but he's not like, yeah, I want to go to the kid.
The whiniest he gets is when he complains about not going to Tashi Station to pick up power converters.
Unlike Anakin's early performances, where he's always whining. But anyway, what's interesting about this, there's footage on the internet from Mark Hamill's early auditions and early rehearsals of the film, read-throughs. He's like so much better. Like he's so naturally Luke. It's crazy. But then it's interesting. His early performances are better than his taped performances, which makes me wonder, what the heck are you doing, George Lucas? How are you directing this movie?
Of course, I mean, the thing with takes is you never know because it's not just a performance, it's also how the lighting is or how the sound is getting picked up or, if something something falls onto the shot that shouldn't have. So it's always hard to say why they'll go with one shot over another because in a lot of cases, it has nothing to do with the actors. It could be something else that went wrong or malfunctioned on set and then they decided to do it again. So I wouldn't necessarily say that was George, or at least I don't think that automatically indicates George Lucas misdirecting the movie.
Should we talk a little bit about George Lucas' direction in this? Because it's not like I don't hate it or anything, but I don't know if it's because Lucas directed, but like to me has the feel more of a romance and an adventure, especially in later portions. Once they get to the Death Star, right up until the end, it's basically a swashbuckler. It's very much in the mode of Adventures of Robin Hood or something like that.
Oh,
I mean, we even have a scene where Luke swings across a chasm on a rope with a woman in his arms.
Right.
I mean, there's very much a way that he pays homage to older adventure stories and that sort of thing. But I will say, I do like the way that he as a director builds up this world. I think that's maybe his best trait as a director. In this, there really is so much care. Even if certain effects don't hold up, I'm just amazed at the production design, especially. I can't believe how well thought out this world was.
Until he introduced midichlorians in episode 1. That
Well,
was the end of his world building.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I'm talking about this movie for now.
Yes.
I always interpreted that as simply a scientific explanation of how the Force.
We don't need a scientific explanation of how the Force works. That's the beauty of the Force. It's supposed to be mystical and not always understood.
I'm not saying it's necessary, but I think people were overly hating on that. Like maybe that detail wasn't needed, but I think people are overblowing it when they're like, oh, that destroys the mystical feeling of the world.
The internet does love to overblow things, but objectively speaking, not good value. Trying to stay on topic of George Lucas's direction, though, has anyone read the articles about how the glory of the original trilogy was more of a happy accident between him and his wife's editing? Has anyone heard that?
I have not heard that.
I forget exactly her position, but she was very influential in the original trilogy, and some people credit the entire wonder of it to her, and they point to the X-wing scene when they're doing their bombing run on the Death Star. And if you see the original edited version that George wanted to put out, it's very long, very drawn out, very unexciting. But then she comes in and re-edits it, and we get the wonderful final scene. I'm not sure really the terms in editing, but she made it what we know today. Listeners and you guys will have to do your own Google searches for this, but that's an interesting concept, and it definitely explains, or at least part of the factors in why the original or why the prequel trilogy wasn't as good, because by then they were divorced and no longer working together.
I mean, I'm looking at the IMDb page right now, and it looks like there's 3 credited film editors, including Marcia Lucas, along with Richard Chew and Paul Hirsch, apparently. And then there's another editor who I guess did the 1997's special edition, but George Lucas is also uncredited as a film editor. I see what you're saying, and it's interesting because I have some mixed feelings about the Death Star run in terms of the way that it's directed and edited, because I think Empires are done better almost in every way. I do like the choice to cut between the pilots, both the Rebel and the Imperial pilots on that Death Star run, seeing them in their cockpit and then seeing outside. I think there is some stuff done there with the editing that's actually pretty good, and there's definitely an intensity to that because of it. However, there are other scenes where there'll be like one of the Rebel pilots firing at a TIE fighter, and then we'll see the TIE fighter, and it looks like it's totally not even in the same place where the X-wings are. It looks like they just cut to a stationary X-wing that blows up.
I got that sense more from the Millennium Falcon scenes, like the idea that they were clearly cutting in 2 different bits of footage.
Yeah, but it was very jarring. I felt like we had just exited the battle and gone into some random vacuum where there's an X-wing just hanging out. It doesn't look like the X-wings that had been pursuing them. So it's stuff like that where I feel like maybe the action scenes in this movie don't work as well as some of the later movies.
Or you could maybe notice some corners cut here and there. Which, again, in hindsight or on a second viewing, can sort of detract from the film, and I do think it pulls this one back a little bit. That said, though, one bit that lost none of its effect from when I first saw the movie, one part of the movie I think is aged very well. Very first firefight between the Rebels and the Stormtroopers, which finishes with Darth Vader's first appearance. That, I think, is a great opening scene, a way to give you a sense of the action and of the mystery, but contained enough and short enough that you're still wanting more and you're ready for whatever comes next.
It's almost like you get this cloud of smoke that he enters through. It's almost like, yes, iconic villain is entering, but no, I don't mean that like it's so obvious or anything. It just is.
It's the right way to be obvious about it. I have to say, you know who I think are really underrated? The guys they had playing the Imperial commanders in that movie. Those like Tarkin, the other guy. This is now the ultimate power. The one guy with an Irish accent for some reason. If the rebels have gained a full schematic of the plans, they might find a weakness and exploit. He's like chewing the camera out. There's all those Imperial commanders I think are just fantastic, but no one talks about them.
Tarkin he was probably the best performance in the movie, Tarkin.
I would not disagree with that. I would not disagree with that at all.
I'm still probably partial to Harrison Ford, but I do really like Peter Cushing as Tarkin though. As soon as you see him, you know he's evil. He's been chiseled specifically for that purpose, to look evil.
Is he British too?
Yeah, he played. In fact, he played the first Doctor in one of the movies in Doctor Who. Yeah, he wasn't the first Doctor because it's a long, complicated history.
We've talked about some things that work and some things that don't work. There's certain scenes that I don't think work as well in this movie, which are the ones with anytime there's a huge loss. I'm thinking of when Luke discovers the charred bodies of his aunt and uncle. I'm thinking of the scene where Alderaan is blown up. I felt like maybe Lucas didn't have the right. I don't feel like he didn't facilitate those scenes well to really give us this sense of loss. I don't know if maybe if the acting had been a little bit better from Mark Hamill in that first scene or from Carrie Fisher in that second scene, that we might have felt something more. But as they happen, they feel perfunctory to me. I think Lucas wants us to feel lost, but I don't know if he does enough. It's like he wants to move the story along.
This is a good point. I think the scene where we feel lost the best is in the very end when Biggs dies. And the only reason we feel that the most is because of John Williams' score. It gets like really in the minor key, so we can feel it in the music. But you're absolutely right. That's a great point. Kayla pointed out when she was rewatching it with me that we never really see Leia mourn. I mean, her whole planet, everyone she knew and grew up with, just got vaporized, and we never see any reaction to that.
I mean, we see a little bit, but it doesn't feel like your entire planet was blown up. I mean,
Right,
imagine the
right.
entire Earth blowing up. That's
Right.
basically what. And I mean, yeah, it's like intended to be this grand moment, but it also feeds into the next scene because we see the aftermath and we see when the Millennium Falcon comes out of.
And I think the
Hyperdrive.
next time we see Leia, she makes a quip. Aren't you a little short to be a stormtrooper? Her whole planet just blew up, and she's making quips about the size of the stormtrooper.
And she's doing a supermodel pose when he walks in.
Yes, yes. I don't know what else we can say about that though. That's a great point. And it probably is. I don't know what to blame it on. If we have to blame it on anything, just not written properly.
It could be a little bit intentional because I think at the end of this day, this is a swashbuckling romance, and so maybe to harp on it too much would, potentially depress people. Because I feel like the second movie manages to do some of those moments. They really have more power than some of the scenes in here.
And I feel like I don't feel a loss in this movie in episode 4. I don't feel a loss with the loss of loss. But do you know what I mean? Like we don't see Leia mourning her planet, but I don't feel like that's detrimental to the film. Whereas in some films, you need that emotional weight.
I think it's the kind of thing where you only really notice it afterwards, like what we're doing now, after having sat down to watch the movie again, and now we're thinking about it, and now we're coming up with it. I think the Star Wars movies are at their best, not when they're perfect or when they're flawless, because even at their best, I think there's tons of stuff you can pick apart in these movies. I mean, none of them are like, none of them are unassailable, perfect gems of cinematic filmmaking or of acting or of screenwriting, but when they work best, they just push it all away while you experience the movie, and then afterwards, sort of like other movies that I think are flawed, like the last two Dark Knight movies from Chris Nolan, Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises. I actually happen to think those movies are equal in quality, but have the same major flaws that you think about. But the difference is the Dark Knight works so well, you don't think about all the issues afterwards. The Dark Knight Rises isn't quite as good, and you start noticing the flaws during the movie, and that's why people don't like it as much. So I think when Star Wars is at its best, there's still little stuff like that you can point out, like, that could have been better, or they could have done more there. But the collective experience kind of pushes that out of your mind until afterwards, and then half hour later, when you're munching on leftover popcorn, you're like, oh, wait a second. I have that moment after almost every Marvel movie.
Yeah, that's true too. Marvel does a good job of that.
Most of the time. A couple of them were not so good at that. I think the Star Wars series has the best opening of just about any movie franchise in history.
The score or
The opening, the Star Wars logo, the music, the shot, the fadeaway into an image of infinite universe, and then the text scroll. I think if you were to do a list of like the greatest openings of a movie ever, I think that would be like right up top. Because imagine you're sitting in the theater. It's one of those experiences like if I could go back in time and be like, say, at the first ever performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Same thing with this. Like if I could be in the first ever showing of this movie when no one in the world had ever heard that music and seen that opening, what must that have been like?
the Star Wars score is probably my favorite score. Maybe the Halo score would come close.
Are we talking just about scores and not like movie scores?
Just in general, yeah, just the general soundtrack.
And I think Lucas had worked with Williams because he really wanted a classical kind of feel to the soundtrack.
I mean, he was also friends with Steven Spielberg, and he was already working with Spielberg at the time.
And also, when I was watching this with Hannah, she was saying that, oh look, he's ripping off another composer there. Like, oh, he's ripping off Gustav Holst there, or Wagner. But I feel like that's because it's so influenced by those things, and it really does give this kind of grandeur.
Well, they say if you're going to steal your art from someone else, steal from the best.
Let me say that I think, and I'll probably say this for every one of these movies, Star Wars is bigger than itself, bigger than Lucas ever thought it would be, and what makes it so special is the community that's been building this world over the course of 40 years. And to go back and watch this original movie, it's so wonderful only insofar as everything else that it's a linchpin in. Does that make any sense?
I mean, it is. Star Wars is one of those things that, in a lot of ways, I think can actually get hurt by how big it's become. Like Citizen Kane or the first Godfather movie or 2001, like these movies that have had such an incredible long-reaching influence. And once they've been done and, the franchises have worn themselves out and they've been parodied and satirized and referenced endlessly and they just become an integral part of the culture, it's hard to separate that and go back to the very first source and look at it for what it is. Like, I know so many people, Citizen Kane, which so many critics laud as the greatest filmmaking achievement of all time, and I know so many people who go back and watch it and they're like, that's the greatest movie of all time. Like, yeah, it was a good movie, but
And I think as a consequence of that, if you're gonna watch Star Wars, you have to watch it young. At least the original trilogy. I don't think if you don't see it when you're growing up and you go back to see it when you're like 25, you're not gonna see why everyone else in the world thinks it's the greatest sci-fi movie ever, because you won't have the level of imagination you have as a child. You'd just be looking at it as a 25-year-old adult.
or especially if you first get exposed to some of the more developed stuff, like if you read some of the books, or play one, or maybe like that one animated Clone Wars series was actually really good.
Which one? There were two.
I'm thinking of the non CGI one. That was the one
Yes.
that I
Oh,
watched.
that was phenomenal.
That's the one the CGI one I didn't bother with. So if you come in later and you experience some of the later, like more developed stuff, it could actually be a letdown to go back to this one, which is
Yeah.
very bare bones, very simple, and like I said, it is very quiet and very slow moving for the first 2/3 of the movie. And for someone who's not looking for that, who doesn't expect that, that could be a letdown. But still, I think all of the originals are really gonna stand the test of time.
And it's also very, like you said, it's a bare bones story, but it's also a very ununique story. It's just the archetypal hero becomes a hero story. And I think actually, Justin, that's a great mirror of what you said, Hannah said about how taking music from all these classical composers. He's taking all these archetypes from all these different stories and blending them into a space odyssey. But Justin, take us out with your thoughts.
I really enjoyed watching this again, and I think like one of the things I was really struck by, and like you were saying, Casey, how this is a world that's bigger than itself, and I really was impressed that this movie made me think that, and made me realize like, wow, they created this world that seemed bigger than itself, even just in this movie, I think, and it's in those little touches, in that detail and the care that went into it. I think it came at a time, and it utilized sci-fi in a way that hadn't been done. I mean, when this movie had been made, he had trouble, like he had to shop this around with a lot of studios. Yeah, but the reason why is because people didn't think sci-fi was going to be mainstream. It was not considered mainstream at that point. And what most people's idea of sci-fi, I think, was, old UFO movies and maybe 2001 and stuff like that. And the idea of setting records in terms of movie watching was unprecedented. And, so it really did take a leap of faith, and the amount of money that went into it. And I think because it was a swashbuckling kind of venture that also, I think, drew upon, like a coming-of-age story as well, it was able to find a real audience. And I don't think people had seen a world like it. I mean, honestly, watching it again now, I'm still astounded by this world that they've created.
And it really it touches on something very fundamental because I saw, we're going to be going through all of the originals. So I sat down to watch A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back back to back. And after that, after 4 hours of Star Wars, for like 2 days afterward, I had this just incredibly warm, happy feeling like in the middle of my chest, just sort of sitting there, just from having, sat down and experienced these movies again. So, on a very instinctive, very basic emotional level, I think they still have the power to really connect with people, and that's why I think they will continue to, because that's a sign, like, especially after several decades, and on a purely superficial level, you watch these movies again, you're like, okay, no, clearly lower budgets, the effects weren't as good, okay, obviously those are puppets, it doesn't look as amazing as some of the stuff we have today, but it still gets you right, right in the heart. That's the sign of a great movie. When it rises above any, superficial aspects that always, age and don't necessarily look as good with time. But the core is there.
I was just thinking about what you said earlier, Casey, about I think all three of us saw them very young. I know I was very young when I first saw them. So,
I don't even remember the first time seeing it. It just was always something I had seen in the past.
and I can't speak to people coming to this series fresh, like having never seen any of the movies before, which I know a surprising amount of people who have not seen any of them, which is like strange to me. But it happens. Like no big deal or anything. But all I can say is having come back to it now at this age, I really was impressed enough. Also, like we were saying before about the humor and the camaraderie between the characters, that really helps, and yeah, it just makes it a fun time if nothing else. Though I think it's a little more than that.
So that's our take on episode 4. Our next one will be about episode 5, which is critically acclaimed to be the greatest of all the Star Wars films up until episode 7. Cough, cough. We'll see. Ciao, guys. Thanks for listening.